January 17th, 1940. The North Atlantic. The wind comes first, always the wind. It howls across the gray expanse of ocean like something alive, something ancient and indifferent to the warships cutting through its swells. On the bridge of a German U-boat prowling these waters, Kapitänleutnant Hans Weber watches the sky darken from slate to charcoal. He has learned to read these skies the way other men read newspapers. A storm is coming, perhaps 12 hours, perhaps less. He orders his vessel to dive, to wait, to let the fury pass overhead while they hunt in the relative calm below. This knowledge, this ability to anticipate the ocean's moods, is not merely convenience, it is survival, it is tactical advantage. And in January of 1940, as Europe plunges deeper into total war, the Germans believe they alone possess the meteorological mastery necessary to dominate the Atlantic battlefield. They are wrong. But they will not discover this truth for years. They will not know that even as Weber's submarine descends into the cold Atlantic depths, a secret is being planted, a seed of intelligence gathering so audacious, so brilliantly concealed, that it will grow into one of the most decisive advantages the Allies will ever possess. The secret is simple. Weather moves from west to east, and whoever controls the weather stations in the western Atlantic controls the future, not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably the way a compass needle finds north, the way winter finds Europe, the way truth eventually finds those who build their empires on partial information. The Germans understand weather. Their meteorologists are among the finest in the world, meticulous, systematic, trained in the rigorous tradition of German scientific education. They have weather stations dotting the Arctic, reporting stations in occupied Norway, observation posts in France. They receive reports from their submarines, from their surface raiders, from their reconnaissance aircraft. They have constructed an impressive network of atmospheric intelligence, and yet there is a gap. A vast, critical, maddening gap. The Atlantic weather systems that will determine whether their bombers can fly over Britain, whether their U-boats can operate effectively, whether their coastal defenses will face clear skies or obscuring fog, these systems originate far to the west, over the mid-Atlantic, over Greenland, over the coasts of North America. And there, in that crucial zone of meteorological genesis, the Germans are blind. The Allies know this. British meteorologists, working in quiet offices far from the front lines, understand that weather is not merely a tactical concern, it is a strategic weapon. And so, in 1940, as France falls and Britain stands alone, a plan begins to take shape. It is not a plan for a single decisive battle, it is a plan for cumulative advantage, for the slow accumulation of predictive power that will, years later, allow Allied commanders to choose their moments with a precision the Germans cannot match. The plan requires deception, endurance, and a willingness to place men in some of the most hostile environments on Earth for months at a time, feeding a stream of data back to London and Washington while remaining utterly invisible to German reconnaissance. They will build secret weather stations in Greenland. The Arctic Theater Greenland in 1940 is not a battleground in any conventional sense. There are no armies here, no fortifications, no strategic cities to capture or defend. There is only ice, vast glacial sheets stretching hundreds of miles inland, coastal fjords locked in permafrost, and a handful of tiny settlements where Danish administrators and indigenous Inuit communities have lived in isolation for generations. When Germany invades Denmark in April 1940, Greenland technically becomes enemy territory. But practically speaking, Greenland is too remote, too inhospitable, too resource-intensive to occupy in force. The Germans do not send divisions to Greenland. They send something more insidious. They send weather teams. In the autumn of 1940, a German trawler modified for Arctic operations slips away from occupied Norway. Its holds contain not weapons or troops, but meteorological equipment, barometers, thermometers, radio transmitters, everything necessary to establish a clandestine weather station on Greenland's eastern coast. The men aboard are not soldiers, but scientists, weathermen who have volunteered for what they understand to be a mission of critical importance. They land in darkness, unload their equipment in temperatures that make exposed skin crack and bleed, and establish a small station hidden among the coastal rocks. For months, they transmit weather data back to Germany. Pressure readings, temperature fluctuations, wind velocity, cloud formations. Each report flows into the German Meteorological Service, where it is analyzed, synthesized, and used to forecast conditions over the Atlantic and Western Europe. It is a brilliant operation. It is also doomed, because the Allies are already there. The United States, though still technically neutral in 1940, has quietly assumed responsibility for Greenland's defense. The reasoning is pragmatic. Greenland's position makes it strategically invaluable, and Washington cannot allow Germany to establish a permanent presence so close to North American shipping lanes. In April 1941, the United States and the Danish government in exile sign a treaty granting America the right to establish military bases in Greenland. Almost immediately, American forces begin arriving, not in great numbers, but in sufficient strength to patrol the coasts, to watch for German operations, and most critically, to establish their own weather stations. But these American stations are different. They are not merely defensive outposts. They are nodes in a vast intelligence network that stretches from the Arctic to the Mediterranean, from the North Atlantic to the Pacific. Every 6 hours, meteorologists at these stations take readings. They measure air pressure with exquisite precision. They track wind patterns, cloud formations, temperature gradients. They encode this data and transmit it via radio to receiving stations in Iceland, in Britain, in Newfoundland. And there, in operations rooms staffed by dozens of analysts, the data is transformed into predictive power, into forecasts that extend 3 days, 4 days, sometimes 5 days into the future. Into the ability to tell a bomber commander whether his aircraft will face clear skies or impenetrable fog over occupied France. Into the ability to tell a naval commander whether a storm front will conceal his destroyer squadron or expose it to U-boat attacks. The Germans suspect something. They must. Their own forecasts, based on incomplete data from the eastern Atlantic, are frequently wrong. British bombers appear over German cities on nights the meteorologists had predicted would be impossible for flying. Allied convoys seem to know exactly when to alter course to avoid the worst of the Atlantic storms. German reconnaissance flights find Allied naval forces in positions that suggest foreknowledge of weather conditions. But suspicion is not evidence. The Germans cannot prove that the Allies have gained a weather advantage. They cannot locate the source of this advantage. And most critically, they cannot imagine the scale of what the Allies have built. By 1942, there are multiple Allied weather stations operating in Greenland. Some are official military installations staffed by uniformed personnel and defended by small garrisons. Others are far more clandestine, tiny outposts occupied by 2 or 3 men living in wooden huts or even ice caves, supplied by occasional parachute drops, communicating by radio sets that must be hand-cranked to generate electricity. These men live in conditions that would break most soldiers. Temperatures in winter routinely drop to 40 below zero. Blizzards can last for days, trapping men inside shelters barely large enough to lie down in. Fresh food is a distant memory. They survive on canned rations and whatever they can hunt or fish. Isolation is absolute. Some stations go weeks without seeing another human being outside their tiny crews. Mental deterioration is a constant threat. The combination of darkness, cold, and solitude drives some men to the edge of sanity. And yet they stay. They take their measurements every 6 hours, as regular as clockwork. They transmit their data through howling Arctic storms, through radio jamming attempts by German forces, through equipment failures and power outages. They stay because they understand, perhaps not in tactical detail, but in fundamental principle, that their work matters, that somewhere to the south their data is being used, that commanders are making decisions based on information that begins here in the frozen darkness of Greenland, with men whose names will never appear in history books. The German hunters. The Germans are not passive. They cannot afford to be. By 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic has become the central struggle of the European war. U-boats prowl the convoy routes, sinking hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied shipping. But weather affects everything. A storm can scatter a convoy, exposing individual merchantmen to easy predation, or it can ground reconnaissance aircraft, leaving the U-boats blind and groping. The Kriegsmarine needs accurate forecasts. They need to know where the weather is coming from, and they need to stop the Allies from having better information than they do. So they hunt. German reconnaissance flights begin probing Greenland's coasts with increasing frequency. They are looking for evidence of Allied weather stations, for radio transmissions, for any sign of permanent installations. Sometimes they find what they seek. In October 1942, a German patrol aircraft spots an American weather station on the east coast of Greenland. The station is small, just 3 buildings and a radio mast, but its existence confirms German suspicions. Within days, a plan is formulated. A German weather team, escorted by armed soldiers, will be inserted nearby to establish a competing station and, if possible, to attack or sabotage the American installation. The operation is launched in March 1943. A German U-boat surfaces off the Greenland coast under cover of darkness and puts ashore a team of 14 men, meteorologists, radio operators, and soldiers, equipped with machine guns and explosives. They establish a camp and begin transmitting weather data. For 3 weeks, they operate successfully, feeding valuable information back to Germany. And then, one morning, they see smoke on the horizon. An American Coast Guard cutter has received reports of unusual radio traffic and has come to investigate. The German team attempts to hide, to blend into the vast Arctic landscape, but there is nowhere to go. The Americans land a shore party. A brief firefight erupts, the only combat action many of these men will ever see. And then the Germans surrender. Their equipment is captured, their station dismantled, and they are transported to prisoner-of-war camps where they will spend the remainder of the war. The incident is classified by both sides. The Americans do not want Germany to know how effectively they are monitoring Greenland. The Germans do not want to admit they have lost an intelligence operation in the Arctic. But the pattern repeats. Throughout 1943 and into 1944, German weather teams attempt to establish stations in Greenland, and Allied forces systematically hunt them down. It becomes a silent, frozen chess match played out across hundreds of miles of ice and rock. The Germans are brave, suicidally so, considering the conditions under which they operate. But bravery is not enough. The Allies have more resources, more aircraft, more ships, and most critically, more weather data. Each German station discovered and destroyed is a victory not merely of arms, but of information. Each captured German meteorologist is interrogated, and the intelligence gathered is fed back into the Allied network, making it stronger, more comprehensive, more accurate. And all the while, the Allied weather stations continue their work. Some are discovered and must be relocated. Some lose men to accidents, to frostbite, to the dozens of ways the Arctic can kill the unprepared. But new stations are established. The network grows. By early 1944, the Allies have achieved something unprecedented, near total meteorological awareness of the North Atlantic region. They can track weather systems from their genesis over Greenland and Labrador all the way to their dissipation over occupied Europe. They can forecast conditions with a 72-hour accuracy that the Germans, working from incomplete data gathered hundreds of miles downstream, cannot match. The Germans sense this. Their meteorologists file reports noting discrepancies, suggesting that the Allies must have weather stations in the western Atlantic. But Germany is losing the war on every front now, and resources are scarce. The Luftwaffe cannot spare reconnaissance aircraft for systematic searches of Greenland. The Kriegsmarine cannot divert U-boats from convoy hunting to meteorological operations. And so the German High Command makes a fatalistic calculation. They will do the best they can with the information they have and hope that Allied weather advantage does not prove decisive. It will. The forecast that changed history, May 1944. The coast of southern England is an armed camp. Over 150,000 soldiers, American, British, Canadian, Polish, French, are concentrated in assembly areas stretching from Cornwall to Kent. They live in tent cities, in requisitioned manor houses, in temporary barracks thrown up in farmers' fields. They perform endless rehearsals, loading and unloading from landing craft, practicing beach assaults on English shores that stand in for the beaches of Normandy. They clean weapons, write letters, play cards, and wait. They know the invasion is coming. They know they are the invasion. What they do not know is when. Neither do their commanders. Not precisely. The invasion of Normandy is scheduled for early June, and the date has been chosen with care. The assault requires a low tide to expose German beach obstacles, a late rising moon for nighttime airborne operations, and reasonable weather, calm seas for the thousands of landing craft, clear skies for air support. These conditions coincide on only a few days each month. The first opportunity is June 5, 1944. The second is June 6th. The third is June 7th. After that, the moon and tides will not align again until mid-July, and postponement that long is considered militarily and politically unacceptable. But nature does not care about invasion schedules. On June 1st, Group Captain James Stagg, the chief meteorologist for Operation Overlord, briefs General Dwight Eisenhower and the Allied High Command. The forecast is grim. A major storm system is developing over the North Atlantic. It will reach the English Channel on June 5th, bringing high winds, heavy cloud cover, and rough seas, conditions that would make the invasion a catastrophic failure. Eisenhower postpones the assault by 24 hours. The invasion will now launch on June 6th if conditions improve. If they do not, it may be postponed indefinitely. June 4th. Stagg briefs the commanders again. The storm has arrived. Outside the windows of Southwick House, where the briefing takes place, rain hammers against the glass. The wind moans through the trees. It seems impossible that this weather will clear in time for an invasion just hours away. But Stagg presents his forecast with quiet confidence. His team has detected a brief improvement in conditions. The storm will pass. For approximately 36 hours, beginning on the morning of June 6th, there will be a window, not ideal conditions, but acceptable conditions. Cloud cover will be heavy, but with breaks. Seas will be rough but manageable for most landing craft. Wind will be strong but within operational limits. After that, the weather will deteriorate again. Eisenhower listens in silence. Around him, his commanders argue the merits of proceeding versus waiting. The naval commanders are worried about the seas. The air commanders are worried about the cloud cover. The ground commanders are worried about everything, about whether their men will reach the beaches, whether the tanks will make it ashore, whether the whole elaborate plan will collapse in the surf. Eisenhower weighs their concerns. And then he looks at Stagg. "How confident are you in this forecast?" Stagg does not hesitate. "I am as confident as I can be, given the nature of meteorology." It is not a ringing endorsement. It is the truth. Weather forecasting in 1944 is not a precise science. It is an art based on data, on pattern recognition, on the accumulated experience of men who have spent years watching how atmospheric systems behave. But Stagg's confidence rests on something his German counterparts do not have: complete data. His forecast is based on reports from dozens of weather stations stretching across the Atlantic, from Greenland to Iceland, from Newfoundland to the Azores, from the coast of America to the coast of Europe. He has seen this storm develop from its earliest stages. He has tracked its movement with a precision that would have been impossible without the secret weather network the Allies have spent 4 years building. Eisenhower makes his decision. "Okay, we'll go." The order ripples outward. In ports and harbors across southern England, engines roar to life. Over 5,000 ships, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports, landing craft, minesweepers begin the intricate choreography of assembly and departure. 13,000 aircraft prepare for flight. 150,000 men board vessels and settle in for the crossing. Some pray, some write final letters, some vomit from seasickness before the ships even clear the harbor. The Armada sets out into the stormy channel, into conditions that would have been suicidal without the foreknowledge that they will improve. And they do improve, not dramatically. The seas are still rough, the clouds still heavy, the wind still fierce. But the conditions are within the limits of what is survivable, what is operationally feasible. On the morning of June 6, 1944, the invasion force reaches the coast of Normandy and begins the largest amphibious assault in human history. In Germany, the weather has fooled the High Command. German meteorologists, working from their incomplete data, have forecast continued storms that should make an Allied invasion impossible. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding the German defenses in Normandy, has taken leave to visit his wife in Germany. He believes the weather provides a brief respite from invasion fears. Many senior German commanders are away from their posts, attending a map exercise. Coastal defense units are not on full alert. When the Allied Armada appears off the coast, the Germans are caught utterly by surprise. Not because they lacked warning of Allied intentions, they have known for months that an invasion was coming, but because they did not believe it could come in such weather. They are wrong because their forecasts are wrong, and their forecasts are wrong because they do not know about the secret weather stations in Greenland, in Iceland, in the mid-Atlantic. They do not know about the hundreds of men who have spent years in frozen isolation, taking measurements every 6 hours with obsessive precision. They do not know about the Allied meteorologists who have synthesized this data into predictive models of unprecedented accuracy. The Germans have fought bravely, brilliantly even, but they have fought blind in the one arena where blindness is fatal: the future. The weight of invisible labor. History tends to remember D-Day for its drama, for the Rangers scaling the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc, for the paratroopers landing in darkness behind enemy lines, for the infantry wading through surf under machine gun fire. These images are seared into cultural memory because they are visceral, comprehensible, cinematically perfect. But the foundation of that victory was laid in places, and by people, history does not remember. In Greenland, weather stations where men lived in holes carved into ice. In operations rooms where meteorologists plotted isobars on charts until their eyes burned with fatigue. In the unglamorous, invisible, essential work of data collection and analysis that made it possible for Eisenhower to say, "We'll go," with anything resembling confidence. The men who staffed those weather stations expected certain things when they volunteered. They expected cold. Everyone knows the Arctic is cold. They expected isolation. The briefings made that clear. What they did not expect was the totality of the experience. The way the darkness in winter is not merely an absence of light, but a presence, a weight that presses down on consciousness. The way the cold is not merely uncomfortable, but actively hostile, searching for any gap in clothing, any moment of inattention, any opportunity to freeze flesh and end life. The way isolation becomes not just loneliness, but a fundamental alteration of reality, where the boundaries between self and environment begin to blur. Some men broke. They were evacuated when possible, replaced by others who might last a few months longer. Some men endured through sheer stubbornness, through an internal hardness that allowed them to wall off the suffering and continue functioning. And some, a small number, but they existed, found a strange peace in the Arctic. They adapted to the rhythm of the work, to the 4 times daily ritual of taking measurements and sending reports. They learned to find beauty in the aurora borealis, in the way moonlight reflects off ice fields, in the absolute silence that descends when the wind stops. They became, in a sense, part of the environment they were sent to observe. But all of them, regardless of how they coped, understood that their work mattered. They might not have known the specifics, operational security prevented that, but they knew their data was going somewhere, being used for something important. And that knowledge sustained them through the worst moments, the times when every rational impulse screamed to abandon the station and seek warmth, safety, human contact. They stayed because soldiers were counting on them, even if those soldiers would never know their names. The Germans who manned their own clandestine stations experienced the same hardships. They took the same measurements in the same brutal conditions. They demonstrated the same courage, the same endurance. But they lacked one critical element. They lacked sufficiency. A weather forecast is only as good as the data behind it, and German data was always incomplete. Their stations were too few, too far east, too frequently discovered and destroyed. They fought valiantly in a battle they could not win because the battlefield, the entire North Atlantic atmospheric system, was too large for them to cover with the resources they had. And so they transmitted their partial data, and German meteorologists did their best to construct forecasts from incomplete information, and German commanders made decisions based on predictions that were wrong just often enough to be catastrophic. The tragedy was not that German meteorologists were incompetent. They were not. The tragedy was that they were forced to work blind while their enemies could see. The symbol of seeing. If there is a symbolic object that represents this story, it is not a weapon or a flag, but a barometer. The barometer, that elegant instrument of glass and mercury, that device for measuring invisible atmospheric pressure, becomes the emblem of the Allied weather advantage. It sits in weather stations from Greenland to Gibraltar, its mercury column rising and falling in response to the weight of air overhead. Meteorologists tap the glass gently before taking readings, a ritual that borders on superstition. They record the measurements in logbooks with obsessive care, noting not just the number, but the rate of change, the trend over hours and days. The barometer measures what cannot be seen. It quantifies pressure, that fundamental property of the atmosphere that drives weather systems, that determines whether tomorrow will bring clear skies or storms. And in this, it becomes a metaphor for the entire Allied intelligence apparatus, the vast network of tools and people and procedures designed to make the invisible visible, to transform uncertainty into foreknowledge. The Germans have barometers too. They have excellent barometers, manufactured to exacting standards in German instrument shops. But a barometer in Berlin or Paris or Oslo can only tell you what the pressure is at that moment in that place. To forecast weather, you need to know what the pressure was yesterday in Greenland, what it is today in Iceland, what the trend suggests it will be tomorrow over the English Channel. You need a network. You need the ability to synthesize data from hundreds of sources into a coherent picture of atmospheric dynamics. The Allies built that network. They built it in secret, at enormous cost, with a patience and foresight that the Germans, brilliant in tactics, often short-sighted in strategy, failed to match. And when Eisenhower asked James Stagg how confident he was in his forecast, the answer was built not on hope or intuition, but on data flowing from weather stations the Germans did not know existed. The unraveling. After D-Day, the war's momentum shifts irreversibly. The Allies establish a foothold in Normandy, break out across France, liberate Paris, drive toward Germany. The Wehrmacht fights desperately, brilliantly at times, but it is fighting a war it can no longer win. Resources dwindle, supply lines collapse. Allied air superiority becomes so overwhelming that German forces can barely move in daylight, and the weather advantage persists. In December 1944, when Hitler launches his final offensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, German planning relies partly on weather forecasts predicting heavy cloud cover that will ground Allied aircraft. The forecasts are initially correct. Fog and snow do ground the Allied air forces, allowing German armor to achieve initial success. But Allied meteorologists, working from their comprehensive Atlantic data, predict a clearing trend with greater accuracy than their German counterparts. When the skies clear on December 23rd, Allied fighter-bombers appear in overwhelming numbers, and the German offensive collapses under aerial bombardment. German commanders, expecting several more days of protective cloud cover, are caught exposed and vulnerable. The weather stations in Greenland continue operating throughout the winter of 1944-45. By now, the network has expanded further. There are stations in Iceland, in the Faroe Islands, in northern Scotland, in Newfoundland. The flow of data has become routine, almost industrial. Thousands of measurements taken every day, encoded, transmitted, received, analyzed, synthesized into forecasts that support operations across multiple theaters. The men who take these measurements are no longer exotic adventurers, volunteering for dangerous assignments. They are doing a job, an essential job, but a job nonetheless. The romance, if there ever was any, has been worn away by repetition and exhaustion. Germany's own weather network is disintegrating. Allied bombing has destroyed meteorological institutes, killed trained personnel, disrupted communications. The stations that remain operational are starved for resources. Some lack basic supplies, paper for recording data, fuel for heating, replacement parts for radio equipment. The reports that reach German military headquarters are increasingly sporadic, increasingly unreliable. By early 1945, German meteorologists are reduced to making forecasts based on data that is hours old, sometimes a full day old, by the time it reaches them. They are predicting the past. When the war in Europe ends in May 1945, the Allied weather network remains operational. It transitions seamlessly from wartime to peacetime use, forming the foundation of what will become the modern international meteorological system. The stations in Greenland are gradually civilianized, their military personnel replaced by government scientists and eventually by automated equipment. The data they collect continues to flow into weather services around the world, no longer secret, no longer part of a desperate struggle for survival, but still essential to the daily work of forecasting weather and saving lives. The reckoning. In the years immediately after the war, as archives are opened and histories are written, some German meteorologists learn about the Allied weather network. They learn about the stations in Greenland, about the comprehensive Atlantic coverage, about the forecasting advantage that contributed to countless Allied successes. Their reactions vary. Some are professionally impressed by the scale and organization of the Allied effort. Some are bitter, seeing it as another example of how Germany was outproduced and outresourced. Some simply nod, unsurprised. They had suspected something like this must exist to explain the discrepancies they observed during the war. But one reaction is nearly universal. They are astonished by the secrecy. For years, German reconnaissance aircraft flew over Greenland. German U-boats prowled the North Atlantic. German intelligence services monitored radio traffic, and yet the full extent of the Allied weather network remained hidden. Some stations were discovered and destroyed, yes, but the network as a whole remained intact, functional, impregnable. It was a masterwork of operational security, thousands of people involved over several years, and not one significant leak, not one compromise that allowed Germany to understand what they were facing. This secrecy was not accidental. It was the result of compartmentalization, of strict need-to-know policies, of Allied counterintelligence efforts that identified and neutralized German agents. But it was also the result of something more fundamental. The men who staffed those weather stations understood that their survival and the survival of their comrades fighting elsewhere depended on silence. They did not speak about their work. They did not write about it in letters home, which were censored anyway. When they returned from their rotations in the Arctic, they told friends and family that they had been stationed somewhere cold and remote, and they let people imagine what that might have meant. The German soldiers who discovered Allied weather stations during the war, during those brief, violent encounters in the Arctic, might have wondered at their purpose. Why would the Allies go to such lengths, endure such conditions, for weather data? But most of those German soldiers did not survive to ask the question in any meaningful forum. They were captured, interned, and by the time they were released, the war had been over for years, and the answer was no longer secret. Some wrote memoirs decades later describing their service in Greenland as a surreal interlude in the war, a place where the true enemy was not the Allies, but the environment, and where the few encounters with enemy forces felt almost incidental compared to the daily struggle against cold and isolation. The inheritance. The legacy of the secret weather stations extends far beyond World War II. The infrastructure built for military purposes became the foundation for civilian meteorology in the post-war era. The International Meteorological Organization, which after the war became the World Meteorological Organization under United Nations auspices, was built partly on the model of Allied wartime cooperation. The principle that weather data should be shared freely across national boundaries, that atmospheric science benefits all of humanity, these ideas were tested and proven in the crucible of war. The men who served in those Arctic stations carried their experiences forward in unexpected ways. Some became professional meteorologists after the war, joining weather services or academic institutions. They brought with them not just technical knowledge, but a philosophical understanding of weather as a global system, of how local measurements in Greenland could affect forecasts in Europe, of how patience and precision in data collection could yield strategic dividends. Others left meteorology entirely, but remained marked by their time in the Arctic. They had seen what human beings could endure, what they could accomplish in the most hostile environments, and they carried that knowledge into civilian life, into business, into education, into politics. And some simply went home and tried to forget. The Arctic had taken something from them, health certainly, in many cases, with frostbite damage and respiratory ailments that would persist for life. But also something less tangible, a piece of their psychological equilibrium, a sense of normalcy. They had lived for months at a time in a world of extremes, and the ordinary rhythms of peacetime existence felt muted, insufficient. Some adjusted, some did not. The literature of post-traumatic stress tends to focus on combat veterans, but trauma comes in many forms, and the isolation and environmental extremity of Arctic service produced its own patterns of psychological damage. The Allied victory in World War II was overdetermined. There were many reasons Germany lost, many advantages the Allies possessed: superior industrial production, greater manpower reserves, the opening of the Eastern Front, the entry of the United States, strategic bombing, naval supremacy, code-breaking at Bletchley Park. No single factor was decisive, but the weather advantage was real, and it mattered, and it demonstrates a broader truth about how wars are won. They are won by accumulation, by the patient building of logistical networks, by investment in capabilities that may not show immediate results, but that compound over time. By understanding that information, even something as mundane as barometric pressure readings from a frozen island can be transformed into strategic power. The silence of snow. There is a temptation, when telling this story, to end with D-Day, to make the Normandy invasion the climax, and treat everything afterward as epilogue. It is dramatically satisfying. It provides a clear moment of payoff, a justification for all the suffering and sacrifice. But this approach falsifies the reality. The weather stations did not exist solely to enable D-Day. They existed because weather affects every military operation, every day, in every theater. They enabled thousands of decisions, large and small, from 1940 through 1945. They saved lives in ways that can never be precisely quantified because we cannot know how many ships altered course to avoid storms they otherwise would have sailed into, how many aircraft took off on missions that would have been suicidal under different conditions. The true epilogue is quieter, less dramatic. It is a weather station in Greenland in the summer of 1945. The war in Europe is over. The war in the Pacific continues, but is clearly winding down. The men at this station take their measurements every 6 hours, as they have done for years. They transmit their data. Somewhere, it is received and analyzed and incorporated into forecasts, but the urgency is gone. The sense that lives depend on absolute precision has faded. They are professionals completing a job, waiting for their tours to end so they can go home. One evening, after transmitting the 1800 hours report, a meteorologist steps outside the station. It is summer, which in Greenland means the sun barely sets, just circles the horizon in an endless twilight. The ice fields stretch away to the east, glowing pink and gold in the low-angle light. The wind, for once, is calm. The silence is absolute. He stands there for a long time, smoking a cigarette, watching the light play across the ice. He thinks about the war, about the reports he has sent, the data he has collected. He wonders if any of it made a difference. He will never know, not really. No one will tell him that his pressure readings on a particular day were incorporated into the D-Day forecast, or that his wind velocity report influenced the decision to launch a bomber raid. Operational security, even in victory, means that the links between data collection and strategic decisions remain obscure. But he suspects, he hopes. He believes that the work mattered, that the months he spent in this frozen place contributed in some small way to the victory. It is a quiet faith, unverified and unverifiable, but it is enough. He finishes his cigarette, grinds it out carefully, no litter in the Arctic, and returns to the station. In 6 hours, he will take another set of measurements. In 3 months, he will rotate home. In 50 years, he will be dead, and almost no one will remember his name or what he did here. But the data he collected will persist, archived in meteorological records, a tiny part of the vast accumulation of atmospheric knowledge that humanity has built. Weather moves from west to east, and information moves from individual observation to collective understanding. This is the lesson of the secret stations, that history is made not only by dramatic gestures, but by patient, invisible work, by measurements taken in darkness and transmitted into the void, by trust that somewhere someone is listening, and that the listening matters. The unseen calculus wars are decided by calculus. Not the mathematics taught in universities, though that too plays a role, but a more fundamental calculus, the weighing of advantage against advantage, the accumulation of small edges into large superiority. The Germans entered World War II with significant advantages: tactical brilliance, operational experience from the Spanish Civil War, superior armor and aircraft in the early years. They leveraged these advantages with devastating effect, conquering Poland, France, the Low Countries, Norway, much of the Soviet Union, and yet they lost. They lost because their advantages were tactical, and the Allies built strategic advantages that compounded over time. The weather network was one such advantage. The initial investment, establishing stations, training personnel, developing analytical methods, yielded no immediate benefit. For months, even years, the data collected in Greenland simply accumulated, building a baseline of understanding. But by 1943, and certainly by 1944, this investment had matured into a decisive edge. Allied commanders could plan with a confidence German commanders could not match. They could choose their moments. They could avoid catastrophic errors that would have resulted from poor weather forecasts. The Germans, for all their tactical prowess, never grasped this. They continued to focus on immediate battlefield excellence, better tanks, better tactics, better training. These things mattered, but they mattered less than the Allies' patient construction of systemic advantages in intelligence, logistics, and, yes, meteorology. Germany fought brilliantly. But brilliance is not enough when the enemy can see the future more clearly than you can. This asymmetry of vision extended beyond weather. The Allies broke German codes, giving them insight into enemy intentions. They developed radar, allowing them to see aircraft and ships beyond visual range. They built the atomic bomb, creating a weapon beyond German comprehension, and they established weather stations in Greenland, giving them predictive power over the North Atlantic atmospheric system. These were all investments in seeing, in penetrating the fog of war, in reducing uncertainty, in transforming the chaotic contingencies of combat into something more manageable, more predictable. The Germans, conversely, allowed themselves to be blinded, not through lack of skill, their scientists and engineers were world-class, but through strategic myopia, through an overemphasis on immediate tactical needs at the expense of long-term capability building. They needed weather data from the Western Atlantic, and they attempted to get it through clandestine stations in Greenland. But their efforts were piecemeal, under-resourced, reactive. They treated weather intelligence as a tactical problem to be solved with individual operations rather than a strategic necessity requiring systematic infrastructure. And so, they lost the weather war, not through any single failure, but through 1,000 small insufficiencies. The poetry of data. There is something poetic about data. In its raw form, it is merely numbers, temperature in degrees, pressure in millibars, wind velocity in knots. But when collected systematically, when aggregated and analyzed, data reveals patterns. It tells stories. A series of pressure readings from stations across the North Atlantic describes the life cycle of a storm system, its birth over Greenland, its maturation over the open ocean, its death over Europe. Each measurement is a glimpse, a single frame. Together, they form a narrative. The men who collected this data were, in a sense, authors. They were writing the story of the atmosphere, one measurement at a time. They could not see the full narrative that required the synthesizing work of analysts hundreds of miles away. But they provided the raw material, the fundamental observations upon which all understanding was built. And like all authors, they poured something of themselves into the work. When a meteorologist stood outside in a blizzard to read a thermometer, when he hand-cranked a radio generator to transmit a report, when he recorded data in a logbook with fingers so cold he could barely hold the pen, these were not merely mechanical acts. They were acts of commitment, of faith in the value of the work, of trust that the data mattered to someone, somewhere. The Germans who hunted these stations understood, perhaps, that they were hunting authors, that each Allied weather station was a voice contributing to a chorus, and that silencing individual voices might disrupt but could not destroy the song. They captured stations, killed men, seized equipment. But the network persisted because it was redundant, distributed, resilient. There was no single point of failure, no critical node whose destruction would collapse the system. It was a modern intelligence network avant la lettre, anticipating the distributed architectures that would characterize Cold War and contemporary intelligence systems. The final measure. In the end, history measures victory in territory gained, battles won, enemies defeated. By these measures, the Allies won decisively. But there are other measures, subtler and perhaps more meaningful. The Allies won the war for information. They won the war for prediction. They won the war for understanding. And in winning these invisible wars, they made victory in the visible war possible. The secret weather stations in Greenland were a small part of this larger victory. They were not glamorous. They did not generate newsreel footage or heroic narratives. The men who staffed them were not celebrated with parades or medals, for the most part. Their work was classified, and when it was eventually declassified, decades had passed, and public attention had moved on. But the work was essential. It was the foundation upon which larger successes were built. And it demonstrated a fundamental truth about modern warfare, that victory belongs not necessarily to the bravest or the most skilled, but to those who see most clearly, who gather information most systematically, who analyze that information most rigorously, who transform data into understanding and understanding into action. The Germans never knew about the secret weather stations, not fully, not in time to matter. They suspected, they probed. They captured fragments of the system, but they never grasped its full extent, never understood how completely they were outmatched in the atmospheric intelligence war. And this ignorance, like so many other German ignorances, about Allied code-breaking, about radar, about industrial capacity, contributed to their defeat. Knowledge is power. It is a cliché, but clichés persist because they contain truth. The Allies knew more than the Germans. They knew what the weather would be in 3 days. They knew where U-boats were hunting. They knew what German commanders were planning. And they used this knowledge to win a war that, by many conventional measures, should have been much more difficult, much more costly, much longer than it was. The weather stations in Greenland stand as monuments, not physical monuments, for most of the original structures are long gone, buried under snow or dismantled decades ago, but conceptual monuments, monuments to the power of patient, systematic work, to the value of investing in capabilities whose payoff may be years away, to the men who endured unimaginable conditions because they believed rightly that their work mattered. On a barometer, the mercury rises and falls with atmospheric pressure. It is a simple physical relationship, greater pressure, higher column. But the simplicity is deceptive, for contained in that rising and falling is information about the fundamental forces shaping weather, shaping history, shaping the outcome of wars. The Allied meteorologists learned to read these signals with extraordinary skill. They learned to see in the subtle movements of Mercury the coming of storms and the clearing of skies. They learned to predict the future, and the Germans, for all their courage and skill, fought a war in which they could not see what was coming. They fought with honor and died with honor. But they fought blind, and in war, blindness is fatal. The secret weather stations of Greenland gave the Allies eyes, and with those eyes they saw the path to victory. This is the truth that endures long after the battles are forgotten, long after the soldiers have returned home or been buried, long after the ideologies have faded into history. The truth that information is power, that patience builds strength, that victory belongs to those who see.